Thank you. Welcome back. I'm going to conclude by showing a few slides about the work of the Office of Disarmament Affairs and some other elements of the UN Secretariat. Of course, the United Nations is a body of member states, but it is supported by a large group of people working in New York and in Geneva and Vienna and elsewhere. And it has various branches and sections in the Secretariat. One of them, so happens to be the smallest one of all the UN Secretariat divisions, is called the Office for Disarmament Affairs, or ODA. And it is headed by a High Representative for Disarmament. Actually, she has the rank of Under Secretary General, and she is a Japanese national, Mrs. Izumi Nakamitsu, and very, very powerful individual with strong beliefs in nuclear disarmament. So if you want to inspire your students, go and look at some of her statements that she has made. So under her, and there are a number of subdivisions. There's the division in Geneva. There's a section that focuses only on weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons. There's a section that deals with conventional arms. There's a section that deals with information, regional disarmament. So each of the main regions in the world has a regional office. These all report to the office in New York, but they also do initiatives and run conferences and meetings and create awareness in their particular regions. So just a little bit of background. The office was established many years ago, and it's basically also designed to advise the Secretary General as well as member states on specific trends in disarmament. It also assists states in negotiations, especially the NPT. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty does not have a secretariat or a body. It meets in New York and in Vienna and Geneva, and it is supported by the Office of Disarmament Affairs. So the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch focuses very much on weapons of mass destruction, but since there is a body implementing the Chemical Weapons Convention, a body that also oversees the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva, and of course there's the IEA and there is the CCBTO, the focus of the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch is very much on nuclear issues. The Geneva branch, which is part of the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch, also offers secretarial support to the Conference on Disarmament. Then I want to move to a very interesting organization within the United Nations, and this is why I'm highlighting it, because it provides substantive information that your students can draw on in preparation, for instance, for this conference. And this is the Institute for Disarmament Affairs, UNIDIR. It is, imagine, a think tank or research institution within the United Nations. It's based in Geneva, and it conducts independent research using both United Nations and outside expertise on a wide range of disarmament and international security issues. It also assists diplomatic negotiations because it provides independent information. And it has become one of the leading voices in emerging security debates. Then finally, the Secretary General appoints an advisory board. This is a board of women and men from a variety of states that would advise the Secretary General on all aspects of disarmament. So I mentioned the agenda for disarmament. This members advise the Secretary General on that agenda. As you can see from the picture, this is the current advisory board. They come from a variety of backgrounds. Just by looking at people that I know, there's a person from the United States, there's a person from Norway, there's a person from Egypt, so they from all over, and more or less not completely gender balanced. They meet twice a year, and a very important part of the UN's work on disarmament. To wrap up, I want to focus on a few challenges that the UN faces. As I mentioned from the outset, the Charter of the United Nations, given the timing of when the United Nations was established, recognizes that 5 states are permanent members. These happen to be the 5 nations that were the victors of the Second World War. As time evolved and as nuclear proliferation took place, those 5 states became the nuclear weapon states recognized by the NPT. So P5 equals N5, and this is very, very dangerous because it sets up a precedent that if you want to have be powerful in the world, you need nuclear weapons. Problem, however, is there are countries with nuclear weapons that are not part of the permanent 5, India, Pakistan, North Korea. And so acquiring a nuclear weapon has become a status symbol. And so, of course, then also, these are the very states that are required to disarm under the NPT, required not to test nuclear weapons under the CTBT, and the only international body that can take action in the form of sanctions is the Security Council. As I already explained, the Security Council P5 members can veto any action. So it's highly unlikely for the Security Council to take action against one of the P5. Then enforcement. Yes, it has adopted many resolutions, including on Security Council Resolution 1540 to prevent states from proliferating, but also to prevent terrorists from getting access. It has adopted almost a dozen resolutions on Iran and almost as many on North Korea, and yet we are concerned about Iran's nuclear program. We know that North Korea proliferated, they walked out of the NPT, they threw the IAEA inspectors out, and they continue making nuclear weapons. So what is the enforcement capability of the UN if all countries are not willing to abide by the decisions? One must remember, the UN is a body of members. It doesn't have its own police force or own army to enforce things. It does have the ability to, for peacekeeping purposes, to deploy troops. The troops that you always see on the news with blue helmets and sometimes white helmets. But they are essentially there to as peacekeepers. They are not there as enforcers. Of course, the General Assembly is the largest representative body in the world, but it can only take normative decisions. It cannot take legally binding decisions like the Security Council. So you have a body of 193 versus a body of 15, and the 15 can take decisions on the behalf of the 193. Its machinery, its disarmament machinery is dysfunctional. There are too many resolutions, and the Conference on Disarmament is deadlocked. So while I very much welcome the Secretary General's disarmament agenda, we have seen many of these before, and I think it is important that young people take a look at this, because the agenda is exactly that. It sets a disarmament agenda for the future. And so as high school students progress through their careers, hopefully they'll get inspired to take one of the elements or a few of the elements and start working on that. The question should also be asked, and this is, I think, a good question to ask in your class. Is the United Nations as relevant today as it was in 1946? And can the UN face up to the proliferation challenges of today? It's a tough question to answer. It's one that many of us have been battling with for a long time. So finally, this is also a good slide that you may want to use to stimulate discussion in your classrooms. A couple of cartoons. The one in the top resembles the sort of Greek or Roman ruins, and it obviously looks at the UN and it's falling apart. The one on the bottom I always find kind of funny. This is a reference to resolutions. So binoculars are for sale, and the salesman says, well, everything looks fuzzy through these. So it's UN resolution is the fuzzy one. Again, it's there to stimulate discussion. And then the one on the right is quite clever. Is the United States part of the United Nations, or is the United Nations part of the United States? This has become quite a controversial issue, especially these days in the United States, and the view about the current administration about the United Nations. But I think the questions need to be addressed is the goals in the Charter still relevant today? And can the Security Council be both an inspector and an enforcer? And given that the current balance of power has changed significantly since 1946, how has this affected the UN's credibility as a player in the non-proliferation regime? Again, take the issue of Iran. So obviously countries on the Security Council have their own agendas vis-a-vis Iran. And Iran and other countries may not have the ability to change that. Yet the Security Council can take a decision that would impact directly on Iran. And I'm just using Iran as an example, and I'm also not suggesting that there's a right or wrong here. I'm simply referring to the process. That is it. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions if there are some.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean. That was really interesting and to some extent provocative lectures. That's what we really needed when we talk about the United Nations. So for the sake of discussion, for those who will be watching this video later, I would like to ask some discussion questions. So as you know, I'm a strong advocate, supporter of the United Nations, but I would like to take some devil advocate. I would like to play some devil advocate for stimulating discussion. So at the United Nations General Assembly, you mentioned the first committee where peace and security issues are discussed. And there are so many resolutions related to nuclear disarmament and the world free of nuclear weapons. And those resolutions are not legally binding, but for norm building. So many, almost 1 month, countries are talking about this, and there are so many important resolutions. But unfortunately, you know, since these are not legally binding, and then countries like the United States are not paying attention to the disarmament resolution. So how would you address this issue? How can we bring these resolutions to more important status? Like how to raise awareness of the importance of General Assembly resolutions?
Thank you, Matsuko. Well, the first thing, of course, to remember is that General Assembly resolutions are non-binding, and you cannot change that. The Charter is what the Charter is. I would even argue that if we had to renegotiate the charter today, we will not have a United Nations. So we must be very careful in criticizing the United Nations, and you are being deliberately provocative, I recognize that, because it is something that we need to cherish. But you are absolutely right. There are too many resolutions. I think my count was at least 68 resolutions were adopted by the first committee this year. And only 25 of them were adopted without a vote. And those 25, that doesn't mean that they represent agreement by all the countries. Some countries simply didn't want to express themselves, and therefore they said, well, this is not important enough for us to raise objection. I should also add that if you vote on a resolution in the General Assembly or in its first committee, the United Nations have actually moved forward quite a bit as far as technology. There's a voting machine, and each delegate has 3 buttons that he or she must press. And those buttons then light up a board in the front of the hall where each country's name appears. And then if you press the green button, that means yes, then there's a green light goes off. If you press no, then a red light goes off. And if you press abstain, meaning that you don't vote yes or no, then an orange light goes off. But it's there for everyone to see. And so if you vote, you make sure that you have the right vote and that you have the support from your government to do that. And of course, this is especially smaller countries, when they take a vote or position on something, the larger powers often pressurize them to change their vote or vote in certain ways. But I think one of the ways that I would hope, and I don't have much hope for it, but people need to be talking to each other more. Dialogue is important. I sense a tendency these days that there's a resolution. I don't like the word of the resolution, so I will just vote no on the resolution. I'll come up and I'll submit my own resolution. And so, one of the resolutions that I actually showed is the resolution on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Probably one of the most controversial resolutions at the moment, right? The resolution was adopted with a vast majority. The treaty was adopted with a vast majority. And we see that every year that countries bring this resolution forward. Still, there are countries, not just the countries without nuclear weapons, because if only the countries with nuclear weapons would have voted against that resolution, then we would have had a maximum of 9 countries voting against it. Yet there are about 30, 40 countries that have abstained or voted against that resolution. Meaning, do they really want nuclear weapons? Or is there something else that can be changed to address them? So unfortunately, I think this is how it's going to be, but my vision is that there should be a limitation on the number of resolutions. And every year there should only be, say, 25 resolutions. And if you go from the other committees in the General Assembly, there's, for instance, a committee on human rights, there's a committee on legal issues, and so on. Other committees have a consensus rule that a resolution cannot be passed with a vote. It must be by consensus. If not, there will not be a resolution.
Okay, thank you. So I have a couple of more questions. Could you please go back to the slide of Secretary General's disarmament and non-proliferation, the agenda for disarmament, the Antonio Guterres.
That one?
This one. And as you mentioned, I plan to include the entire document of this agenda in the useful resources. This is very important. One thing I would like to highlight, and I would also like to ask a question, is at the very bottom of the bullet point, new partnerships. New partnership. So partnership between the United Nations and civil society. Mm-hmm. Antonio Guterres emphasized the importance of the role of civil society, especially after the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted. He emphasized the important role that was played by the civil society. So I believe that the United Nations traditionally try to engage civil society, but I think now recently the role of civil society has significantly increased. So you have been in this field for many years. Could you please share your thought on how civil society's role in the UN United Nations conference have been evolved?
Sure. I don't know if the viewers can see the image that I just put up, but that's in fact. Can you see that, Masako? There's a link embedded in the slide, and so if you click on the link, this is what the agenda for disarmament looks like.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so, so you're absolutely right. Civil society has played an increasingly important role in the United Nations, but has always been on the margins. And so, for instance, the General Assembly and its committees, while members of the public, NGOs, research institutions, academics, may attend meetings of the General Assembly, they can do so in a public gallery. They cannot speak, and they are often restricted in what they even may wear. And so over the years, there's been initiatives to bring civil society in. One of the first times we saw this was during a major campaign in the 90s to ban anti-personnel landmines, where civil society, under the landmine campaign to ban landmines, played a leading role. And of course, we saw it just recently, again, in the years leading to the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, where in fact civil society was sitting in the room when the treaty was negotiated. And that's unprecedented. So, of course, the reality is that it is, despite what the very first sentence of the preamble of the Charter says, we, the peoples of these United Nations, all peoples are not equal in the eye of the UN, because as long as you are a representative of a government, then you have a right to speak. If you are a citizen of a particular country, but not a government representative, you do not have the right to speak. And that, I think, is wrong. And so the UN, as I said, is not without flaws. The only problem is, to fix it, you need consensus. But I think what I find encouraging over the years that I've been involved with the UN is that you see so many more, especially young people, becoming involved in activities of the UN, and especially women becoming involved in the activities of the UN, both as part of the United Nations Secretariat, but also as members of delegations, but even more importantly, as non-government delegates. And so we are talking not only about people that, are activists. There's always a value in being activist, but sometimes activism in the UN is frowned upon. So what I find encouraging is that more and more people, and this is, I think, the success of the TPNW, is that people come prepared to these meetings and they are experts themselves. Expertise on these issues do not lie only in the hand of governments. In fact, there's more expertise, in my view, outside of government than inside governments. And I think the United Nations in its reform, and that's why the Secretary General has highlighted this, need to strike partnerships with civil society as equal partners, and not in a way as that, well, we'll hear you, but we're not going to do anything about it.
Great, thank you. I completely agree that the role of civil society is getting more and more important, especially the governmental officials' position change very often. For example, in certain countries, disarmament experts stay in that position just for 3 years. But civil society experts stay very long time. Like for example, our center, Dr. Porter, he has been in this business for over 30 years. So many governmental officials are asking for the civil society members' opinion or advice. So I really believe it's very important to incorporate civil society's voice in many ways. So my next question is a little bit more, I don't know what to say, but more discouraging or controversial. Well, I don't know if we have answer. So you also mentioned at the very end of your slide, actually the second from the end, when you put the challenges. I think one of the most difficult challenge in the field of nuclear disarmament is, as you rightly put, at the very top of this bullet point, permanent member of the Security Council is a nuclear weapon state. So it's very difficult to see the progress in nuclear disarmament. Of course, I understand that the UN reform requires enormous efforts, and many people have been talking about Security Council reform many years, but it has never happened. So given the fact that all the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are the NPT, nuclear weapon state, how actually United Nations can be productive or effective in order to make a real actual impact in the nuclear disarmament progress?
Very good question and a very hard one to answer. But I want to maybe put a more positive spin on it. In the Security Council has taken, maybe not binding, but has taken a number of initiatives over the years to focus on the threat of nuclear weapons. And I remember one very well, and this was in 2009, when President Obama chaired the council. During the high-level segment of the General Assembly in September, heads of state come to New York, and they're there for the opening of the General Assembly. And it is quite dramatic to see sometimes 150, if not more, heads of state and foreign ministers. The New Yorkers don't like it because it created travel nightmare, but it is quite significant. And this is when some of these major documents are released and decisions are taken. But normally, whoever chairs the Security Council, it rotates, then takes an initiative. And in that particular time, in 2009, and bear in mind, this was just after President Obama's famous Prague speech, where he referred to the need for nuclear disarmament, promised the ratification of the CTBT, and subsequently won the Nobel Peace Prize for those initiatives. But he chaired the Security Council, and the United States' initiative was to make a statement through the Security Council and with all Security Council member support. It remains one of the most important statements issued by the Security Council. It was not a binding resolution, but that statement, I think, is still valid. Of course, It's 10 years later. None of the promises that were made in that Security Council statement have been fulfilled. In fact, they've moved backwards. But I just want to emphasize that there are positive elements that can come out. So while, I think today our young people probably look at what's going on and say, what can we do to prevent a nuclear war? I think we need to always remain positive that life goes through cycles. And I think we'll find that more moderate views will prevail. And hopefully we will soon be going back to a Security Council that can look at itself, where it says, this is enough. Because in fact, Security Council members, including the P5, they represent the security interest of all members, not of themselves. That's what the treaty, what the charter says. And it's important for states as they elect members of the Security Council, the non-veto power members, to make sure that they put members in there that have the means to take responsible decisions on international peace and security. Unfortunately, and here I will wear my critical hat again, it has become a status symbol to be part of the Security Council. And so sometimes the decisions of the Council cannot really be explained because some countries on the Council may be weaker than others in terms of how much they can withstand pressure from the bigger ones, or they have their own agendas. And that would not necessarily be the agenda of the broader UN membership.
Great, thank you. So my final question intends to draw some of your advice to young generations, high school students. So regardless of many challenges, it is really fair to say that the United Nations has played a very important role in the peace and the security and the nuclear disarmament. Well, it's debatable, but so it is very important for young generations to learn more about how United Nations works, and also it is important for young generations to feel that the United Nations is really close to their life, because I'm not sure how many high school students are involved in this kind of a debate. Of course, there is a model United Nations that high school students can also join. But you also mentioned that you started developing your interest in the United Nations. So maybe you could give some advice on that point, how the younger generations can learn more about the United Nations and how they can bring United Nations closer to their life.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, you must remember that if it had not been for the forum that the United Nations create in a variety of ways, whether it's a General Assembly or meetings in Geneva or whatnot, the issues of nuclear disarmament would be left only to the nuclear weapon states. Right? There's no one that publicly can take them on. The NPT has a review conference, which is, all countries of the members of the treaty participate, but that's also under the auspices of the United Nations. The United Nations offer their facilities for this and provide secretarial support for those meetings. So the United Nations offers the opportunity for all member states to view and express their concerns. And some do it more forcefully than others and so forth. As I said, I think civil society is playing an increasingly important role. My advice to young people is to actively learn more about the United Nations. Challenge your teachers to talk more about it. It's almost, the United Nations is like, look through these very very low resolution binoculars because everything is fuzzy when it comes to the United Nations. Maybe so, but there's a lot of good work that the UN does, especially in this field. And I think it is important for an incoming generation to be as inspired by the work of the UN that I was when I was at high school. And it is something that, I always dreamed about, working for the UN and working with the UN. And once you get involved, it becomes almost like an affection. I mean, you want to do more. You become, there's just this, you become an international civil servant. And there is nothing more rewarding than working for the public in any public sector. If you work for a government, if you work for in support of other humans, it is extremely rewarding. And the ultimate way to do that is to get involved with the United Nations in whatever way. There are a variety of ways. Students may not necessarily think that, well, we're going to be one day working in nuclear disarmament for the United Nations. But there are other ways that you can get involved and you can make a difference. And the United Nations is a very old organization. I believe it will continue to flourish, but it is really about the new agenda for the United Nations. Because if the United Nations cannot keep up with today's challenges, today's trends, and remain relevant for next generations, it will become a very boring old organization. It may even go down the same route that the League of Nations went in the early part of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. So on that note, I would like to conclude today's session. And as Jean mentioned, the youth is very important, especially the recent years. The United Nations really trying to engage the more youth. So they also established some United Nations youth champion. So you can find all those information if you go to the website, UN website, and just Google the United Nations Youth Champion. There should be lots of ways for you to be part of the United Nations work. So thank you so much, Jean. That was really informative and encouraging lecture. Thank you. And if you have any questions, teachers and students, if you have any questions, please feel free to send us your question. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.